The 2026 World Cup was supposed to be the biggest tournament in football history. 48 teams, 3 host nations, 104 matches, and a stage bigger than the sport has ever had. But now, with the tournament well into its group stage, a new conversation has emerged that has nothing to do with goals or tactics, and everything to do with what happens every 20 minutes during every single match. UEFA, European football's governing body, has just delivered a verdict on one of FIFA's most controversial decisions of this entire World Cup. And the verdict is essentially this: not at our tournaments, thanks. European football is not preparing to turn every match into 4 quarters the way the World Cup has. UEFA has confirmed it has no plans to change its own cooling break rules for either the Champions League or Euro 2028, despite FIFA's mandatory hydration breaks becoming one of the single biggest talking points of this entire World Cup. That's not a minor scheduling footnote. That's Europe's most powerful football body looking directly at FIFA's flagship innovation for this tournament and quietly, firmly declining to follow suit. So what's really happening here? Why has a 3-minute pause in play become one of the defining controversies of the biggest World Cup ever staged, and why does Europe want absolutely nothing to do with it? Let's break down exactly what FIFA introduced, why UEFA is taking a different path, and what this entire saga reveals about the direction the sport's biggest tournament is heading. Start with the background, because understanding exactly what FIFA did and why matters enormously before getting into why it's caused this much friction. In December last year, FIFA's chief tournament organizers announced that hydration breaks would be mandatory in every single match at the 2026 World Cup. 3 minutes, roughly 20 minutes into each half, regardless of venue, regardless of weather, regardless of whether the stadium has a roof and full climate control or sits wide open under a blazing summer sun. The governing body said the policy was designed to ensure equal conditions for all teams in all matches, and the rules drew directly from last year's FIFA Club World Cup, also held across the United States, where temperatures soared into the 90s and beyond in multiple host cities. The science behind the original concern is genuinely serious, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as an overreaction. Experts have warned that this summer's World Cup, co-hosted across the United States, Mexico, and Canada, could be the hottest in the tournament's history. When an athlete's internal body temperature exceeds about 105 degrees Fahrenheit, they can become confused, aggressive, or even lose consciousness, according to sports science researchers who study heat illness in athletes. Exertional heat stroke during sport is among the leading causes of death for athletes worldwide, and dehydration only makes that risk worse. Players competing in extreme heat can lose between 1 and 2 liters of sweat every hour, and most don't drink enough to replace what they're losing. Even losing as little as 2% of body weight to dehydration can measurably impair physical performance. A group of researchers, including Yuri Hosokawa, an associate professor at Japan's Waseda University, and Douglas Casa, chief executive officer of the University of Connecticut's Corey Stringer Institute, actually co-signed a formal letter to FIFA back in May, urging even stricter heat guidelines than the ones eventually implemented, including a recommendation that cooling breaks last at least 6 minutes rather than 3. Their reasoning was specific. Casa explained that the actual impact of a cooling intervention, whether from fluids or from physically cooling the body with wet towels on the neck, head, back, and arms, depends heavily on how much time you give it. Properly applied cooling can reduce body temperature by roughly 1/5 of a degree Fahrenheit per minute, which is why his group felt 5 or 6 minutes would make a meaningfully bigger impact than 3. It's worth understanding exactly what exertional heat illness actually looks like in practice, because the underlying medical concern driving this entire debate isn't abstract. Common symptoms include muscle cramps, extreme fatigue, impaired performance, headache, irritability, nausea, dizziness, and worsening dehydration, all of which can develop quickly during high-intensity exercise in hot, humid conditions.
The body's core temperature rising too high places serious strain on the heart, the nervous system, and the muscles simultaneously, which is exactly why sports scientists treat this as a genuine emergency risk rather than simple discomfort. Hosokawa's research has specifically focused on the threshold at which players begin showing signs of confusion or aggression, symptoms that can be mistaken for simple frustration on the pitch when they're actually early warning signs of a developing medical emergency. That distinction matters enormously for broadcasters and commentators trying to read a player's behavior in real time during a match, and it's part of why the medical community pushed so hard for FIFA to take this seriously in the first place, even if they disagreed exactly how the policy was eventually implemented. So the underlying problem FIFA was trying to solve is real, supported by genuine medical expertise, and not something serious football people are simply inventing to complain about. Nobody serious is arguing player safety in extreme heat doesn't matter. Here's where things get interesting though, because the way FIFA chose to apply this measure is where almost all of the actual controversy originates.
FIFA decided the breaks needed to happen in every match, applied with total uniformity, specifically to ensure equal conditions for all teams across the whole tournament. That includes matches played late at night, that includes matches played in mild, comfortable weather, and it includes matches played entirely indoors, under closed roofs with full air conditioning running throughout the stadium. England's opening match against Croatia became the clearest illustration of the problem almost immediately. Played at AT&T Stadium in Arlington, Texas, with the roof closed and air conditioning on, the match was still interrupted by the mandatory stoppage. Fans inside the stadium booed loudly, repeatedly, both times the break arrived. The reaction wasn't really about 3 minutes of inconvenience. It was about the obvious disconnect between FIFA's stated justification, genuine heat risk to players, and the actual conditions inside a climate-controlled dome where that risk simply didn't exist. This pattern repeated across multiple matches in multiple cities. Coaches openly questioned why the breaks were necessary at every single game rather than being applied only when conditions genuinely warranted it. Players have spoken about how the stoppage disrupts what should be 2 continuous halves, turning the match into something that feels structurally closer to the 4-quarter format associated with American sports like basketball or the NFL, rather than the 2-half rhythm football has used for over a century. Uruguay head coach Marcelo Bielsa became one of the most vocal critics ahead of his side's clash with Cape Verde, criticizing the breaks directly in his pre-match comments. Belgium boss Rudi Garcia took a slightly different angle, openly describing the stoppage as useful as what he called a coaching break, an opportunity to get extra tactical instructions to his players mid-half, which is its own kind of admission that the pause is being used for something other than pure player welfare, whatever its original intention. Virgil van Dijk, meanwhile, argued that every game should be judged separately rather than having one blanket rule applied regardless of circumstances, a position that's hard to disagree with on the surface, since nobody is suggesting heat safety doesn't matter in the matches where it's genuinely a factor. But that's only part of the story, because the breaks have generated a second, entirely separate controversy that has nothing to do with player welfare at all, and everything to do with money. 3 months after the original December announcement, FIFA confirmed it had given commercial broadcasters the green light to show advertisements during the hydration breaks. Broadcasters have been given the option to either go to split screen or cut away entirely to commercial content while play is paused. FIFA set specific guidelines around this, with adverts not permitted to start within 20 seconds of the referee blowing for the break, and broadcasters required to return to live action more than 30 seconds before play resumes. Strict rules also limit total commercial time during any single break to 130 seconds. Fox, broadcasting the tournament in the United States, reportedly fell foul of those very limits during the World Cup's opening match, cutting to advertising and returning late to live play, missing real action as a result. Telemundo, broadcasting in Spanish, avoided full-screen advertising during the same breaks, choosing a different approach entirely. That contrast between broadcasters, one pushing the commercial opportunity to its limit and beyond, another choosing restraint, has fueled exactly the suspicion critics raised from the very beginning, that a measure introduced and justified entirely around player welfare had, within months, become a lucrative in-game advertising slot, something football as a sport has traditionally and deliberately resisted throughout its history. This matters because it connects directly to a broader anxiety running through this entire World Cup, the sense among many longtime fans that the tournament's expansion to 48 teams, its three-country hosting structure, and now its restructured match rhythm are all pointing in the same direction, toward a version of football increasingly shaped by American sports broadcasting conventions and commercial logic rather than the traditions the rest of the football world grew up with. Now, here's where UEFA enters the picture, and where the European response becomes genuinely significant, rather than simply another voice in the chorus of criticism.
UEFA has a completely different, pre-existing policy already written into its regulations, one that predates this entire World Cup controversy, and that the organization has confirmed it will not be changing. Cooling and drinks breaks are already covered under UEFA's own rules. In matches where conditions might warrant a break, the UEFA match delegate physically measures the temperature using a digital wet bulb globe temperature thermometer, or in exceptional cases, a standard thermometer positioned at head height roughly 1 meter inside the pitch. Mandatory cooling breaks only get triggered once that reading crosses a specific scientific threshold, 32 degrees Celsius wet bulb globe temperature, or 35 degrees Celsius using a standard reading for senior competitions. Below that threshold, any drinks breaks that do happen remain at the discretion of the match officials, rather than being automatically mandated. A UEFA spokesperson confirmed directly to reporters that there are no plans to change this approach for either the Champions League or Euro 2028. In other words, UEFA already has its own genuinely science-based, threshold-driven system for deciding when a cooling break is actually necessary, and it's choosing to stick with that system rather than adopt FIFA's blanket, identical every match approach. This matters because it draws a very clear contrast between two different philosophies of how to apply player welfare science. FIFA's position, repeated by tournament officials, is that absolute consistency across every match is essential for competitive integrity, the idea being that if one team gets a cooling break, every team should get the exact same break, regardless of their specific conditions, to avoid any sense of an uneven playing field between matches. UEFA's position is that the actual science should dictate when a break happens, using real measured temperature data match by match, rather than applying a single fixed rule everywhere, regardless of whether the underlying risk factor that justified the rule in the first place is actually present. Both positions have a coherent internal logic, but UEFA's quiet declaration that it won't be following FIFA's lead lands, in the middle of a World Cup where the breaks have become a constant flashpoint, as something close to a verdict from Europe's most powerful football institution. It's worth a 70-degree Fahrenheit match getting the identical treatment as a 95-degree one isn't really about consistency, UEFA's policy implies. It's about whether the underlying risk is actually present. Consider what this means practically for a competition like the Champions League, which is played across dozens of different cities and climates throughout a single season, from freezing winter nights in Northern Europe to considerably warmer evenings further south. If UEFA had decided to follow FIFA's example, every single one of those matches, regardless of season or location, would need an identical mandatory stoppage built into its structure. Instead, UEFA's match delegates will continue making that determination on a fixture-by-fixture basis using actual measured data, exactly as they have done for years before this World Cup controversy ever existed. That continuity, choosing not to change a working system simply because FIFA introduced a different one on a bigger stage, is itself a meaningful statement about which approach UEFA considers more credible. This timing matters too. UEFA's clarification arrived in the same window as another notable decision involving FIFA's handling of this tournament. Just a week before confirming its stance on hydration breaks, UEFA had appointed Somali referee Omar Artan to officiate the 2026 UEFA Super Cup between Paris Saint-Germain and Aston Villa,
a deliberate, high-profile gesture that came just days after Arton had been denied entry to the United States and prevented from officiating at the World Cup itself, a tournament he'd been selected for entirely on merit. Taken together, both decisions paint a picture of a European governing body that has, in a fairly short space of time, drawn two separate lines distinguishing its own approach from FIFA's handling of specific situations at this tournament, without engaging in direct public confrontation, but making its position unmistakably clear through action rather than rhetoric. Let's make this human for a moment, because behind every policy debate are real players and real fans experiencing the consequences of these decisions in real time. Picture a player who has trained their entire career around the rhythm of two uninterrupted 45-minute halves, only to find that rhythm structurally altered at the single biggest tournament of their life, with a mandatory stoppage arriving whether they need it or not. FIFA's own chief tournament officer, Manolo Zubiri, has acknowledged that if a stoppage for injury happens to occur right around the 20th or 21st minute anyway, the referee can simply treat that as the hydration break and fold it into existing play, rather than adding an entirely separate interruption. That flexibility exists in theory, but in most matches, players are still experiencing a fixed, predictable pause that has nothing to do with the actual flow or momentum of the game they're trying to play.
And picture the Iran national team, who have faced a uniquely difficult set of circumstances simply getting to this tournament at all, with their manager speaking publicly about the broader logistical experience of competing at this World Cup. Iran's manager detailed serious travel delays getting into the United States and said plainly that FIFA had not succeeded with the tournament's logistics, a remarkably blunt public assessment from a manager whose primary focus should be entirely on football. When even basic travel and tournament logistics are drawing this kind of criticism from inside the competition itself, a debate over breaks in play becomes just one more item on a growing list of frustrations rather than an isolated complaint. For fans inside these stadiums, many of whom have already navigated significant costs and logistical hurdles simply to attend, watching the match they traveled for get paused for a reason that visibly doesn't apply to their specific venue adds a layer of frustration that compounds everything else already swirling around this tournament's broader controversies. So where does this leave the rest of the competition, and what happens from here? The most likely scenario, based on FIFA's public comments so far, is that the policy remains exactly as written for the remainder of this World Cup. FIFA has consistently maintained that the hydration breaks must be respected at all matches, specifically for the sake of consistency and competitive integrity across the tournament, and there's no indication officials are planning a mid-tournament policy reversal. That means the boos, the criticism, and the recurring debate about commercial use are likely to continue match by match through the knockout rounds, rather than fading away the way some pre-tournament controversies eventually have at previous World Cups. What does seem clearer following UEFA's statement is that this specific innovation is unlikely to spread beyond this single tournament. Europe's biggest competitions, the Champions League and Euro 2028, will continue operating under the existing threshold-based system rather than adopting FIFA's blanket model. That suggests the mandatory, identical everywhere hydration break may end up being remembered as a feature unique to the 2026 World Cup specifically, rather than as the beginning of a permanent structural change to how football is played at the highest level. There's also a genuine open question about whether other domestic leagues might experiment with their own version of this idea, inspired by the financial reveal that's followed FIFA's approach, even if they implement it with more flexibility than FIFA chose to apply. Whether that happens and how it's received if it does remains to be seen. It's also worth considering how this entire debate might shape FIFA's own thinking heading into future tournaments beyond this one. Major rule changes in football rarely get reversed mid-competition, but they do tend to get quietly revised between editions once the full picture of how they actually played out becomes clear.
If broadcaster commercial use of the breaks continues to dominate the conversation as much as it has in these opening weeks, and if UEFA's threshold-based alternative continues operating without generating anywhere near the same level of criticism, it would be a reasonable bet that FIFA revisits the uniform approach before the next World Cup cycle, rather than locking in an identical policy for 2030, which is set to be hosted across an even wider geographic spread, covering Spain, Portugal, and Morocco alongside opening matches in South America. A tournament spanning that many time zones and climates would make a rigid one-size-fits-all rule even harder to defend than it already has been this summer. So here's where things stand. FIFA introduced hydration breaks for genuinely defensible safety reasons, applied the policy with a rigidity that's generated sustained criticism from players, coaches, scientists, and fans alike, opened the door to commercial use that's deepened suspicion about the policy's true motivations, and now finds itself facing a quiet but unmistakable rebuke from UEFA, which has chosen to stick with its own science-based, threshold-driven approach rather than follow FIFA's lead into a one-size-fits-all model. Whether this becomes a defining storyline of how the 2026 World Cup is remembered, or simply fades into a footnote once the knockout stages produce genuinely unforgettable football, is still an open question. What do you think? Does FIFA's argument for total consistency across every match hold up, even when it means stopping play in conditions that clearly don't require it? Or does UEFA's threshold-based approach represent the more sensible path forward for the sport? And would you be in favor of seeing other tournaments adopt some version of a hydration break, provided it's only triggered when the actual temperature data calls for it? I'd genuinely like to know where you land on this. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown useful, a like goes a long way, and subscribing means you'll catch every update as this story keeps developing throughout the tournament.